The summer sun glared off the water like polished glass, the kind of heat that settles into your skin and makes the air shimmer at the edges. Cicadas hummed in waves from the tree line, the sound rising and falling like the breath of the land itself. A lazy breeze wandered through the pines and stirred the surface of the lake, scattering the reflections of clouds into soft ripples. My boat bobbed gently at its mooring, tethered to the old wooden dock that had come with the property, a place that felt like it belonged in a painting rather than real life. It was a simple life, but it was mine. After 20 years climbing the corporate ladder in a concrete jungle of deadlines and fluorescent lighting, I had finally cashed out and traded boardrooms for birdsong. I bought a secluded home on the edge of a small, picturesque lake nestled within a gated community that promised peaceful luxury living. That promise, for the most part, had held true. The neighbors were quiet. The air was clean. And the lake? The lake was everything. It was the reason I moved here. I kayaked at sunrise, fished at dusk, and spent weekends restoring the old Chris Craft runabout I'd bought at an estate sale. That boat, once waterlogged and forgotten, now shone with fresh varnish and pride. Then came the envelope. It arrived without warning, no knock at the door, no introduction. Just a stark white notice stuffed into my mailbox, the kind that makes your stomach knot before you even open it. The bold black letters screamed. Notice of non-compliance. Remove unauthorized watercraft from community lakefront property immediately. I stared at the paper in disbelief. Community lakefront property? Unauthorized watercraft? Was this a joke? My boat was docked behind my own home, on a dock clearly included in the property survey. And that lake, oh that lake, it wasn't community property. Not according to the county records. I would know. I bought it. Years ago when I purchased the land, the lake had been part of a separate real estate deal, an old oversight by the developers who had assumed no one would want to own a body of water. But I did. I made sure the paperwork was airtight. Every muddy inch of the lake bed, every lily pad, every glimmer of surface water? Deeded. Me. I had let the HOA pretend they owned it. They posted signs, scheduled fishing tournaments, and even installed a bench with their logo carved into the backrest like they were kings of the water. I didn't care. Let them fish. Let them pose for retirement selfies by the dock. It didn't hurt me. Until it did. The letter wasn't just a request. It was a command. Remove my boat, or face escalating action. Escalating action. The words felt smug, heavy with the kind of confidence that comes from years of unchecked authority. They didn't just want the boat gone, they wanted to remind me who they thought was in charge. And that's when the quiet part of me, the man who had enjoyed his solitude, who had allowed the HOA to believe in their little fiction, shifted. Something deep in my chest snapped into place, not out of anger but clarity. I'd been kind. I'd been patient. But this? This was a declaration of war, signed and sealed with suburban arrogance. I folded the notice neatly, almost reverently, and walked out to the dock. The lake lapped softly at the shoreline, ignorant of the paper battles waged in its name. My boat swayed gently, the varnish catching the late afternoon sun like gold leaf. I leaned against the piling and thought, they have no idea what they've just done. Because they didn't see me. They saw another homeowner with a slightly nicer boat and a slightly quieter nature. They saw someone who would fall in line, who would move his things and apologize for the trouble. But they were wrong. This wasn't their lake. And I wasn't the guy they thought I was. They wanted a fight? Fine. But it wouldn't be the kind they were used to. I wasn't about to argue over bylaws or attend their smug little meetings with folded hands and polite objections. No, I had something better. Something stronger than rules and signatures. I had the deed. To understand how things got so out of hand, you have to understand the people involved, especially the woman I came to know as Karen, though that wasn't her real name. Her real name was Denise something, but she radiated pure HOA energy, the clipboard, the power walk, the short hair that bristled with judgment. She was the self-appointed guardian of the neighborhood's appearance and order. If a mailbox leaned a degree too far, if a lawn grew a fraction too tall, Denise noticed. And worse, she acted. The HOA had 5 board members, but Denise was the ringleader. A retired elementary school principal, she had redirected all that command and control energy into managing the neighborhood like it was her personal kingdom. She lived 2 streets over from me in a house with plastic flamingos in the yard and wind chimes that never stopped ringing. She had no actual authority beyond what the board granted, but you'd think she chaired the Senate. I had only interacted with her once before, the letter. It was shortly after I moved in when she dropped by to welcome me to the community, or rather to issue a laminated packet of rules. Her smile never reached her eyes, and she looked at my newly parked pickup truck like it had personally offended her. I remember she said, "We try to maintain a certain look here," and then gave the kind of laugh that's more warning than humor. I nodded politely, thanked her for the rules, and didn't see her again for almost 2 years. I suppose, in a way, I was a ghost in the community. I kept to myself. I wasn't unfriendly. I waved at neighbors, helped one guy fix his fence, even bought cookies from the kid down the block. But I didn't go to the HOA meetings or the block parties. I wasn't interested in gossip, politics, or passive-aggressive conversations about mulch. I moved out here to escape all that. Still, I wasn't a nobody. I'd spent my career in contract law, working with major firms in a city where people played hardball over inches and commas. I'd spent decades negotiating multimillion-dollar real estate deals with people far scarier than Denise. But I didn't boast about it. That part of me had been folded away when I retired, until the HOA pulled it back out with one letter. There were others too. Tom, my next-door neighbor, a kind old guy who loved to fish and sometimes waved to me from his canoe. He never got involved in HOA drama, though he once told me in a hushed voice, "Watch out for Denise. She tried to get my shed repainted because it clashed with her hydrangeas." Then there was Emily, a young mom who walked her golden retriever by my dock every morning. She kept to herself, but I'd once overheard her venting to another mom about how the HOA fined her for having a garden gnome. People here lived in fear of the board, even if they wouldn't admit it out loud. They had created a community that looked perfect on the surface. Manicured lawns, pressure-washed sidewalks, smiling neighbors, but there was a quiet tension underneath. One wrong move and you became a problem. That was never going to be me. The lake was my sanctuary, but it was also my property. I bought it not just for its beauty but for the freedom it represented. The developers had offered it at a steep discount when I purchased the house, thinking no one would want the liability. But I saw an opportunity. I bought it outright, had it surveyed, and recorded the deed myself. I even took out a liability insurance policy just in case. Still, I never rubbed it in anyone's face. I let people enjoy the lake. I wasn't territorial or greedy. I just wanted peace. That's what made the letter so insulting. It wasn't just an order, it was a blind assumption. An assumption that I was beneath them. That I could be pushed. And the stakes weren't just about a boat. They were about principle. If I moved that boat, it would be the start of something ugly. Today it's the boat. Tomorrow it's the dock. Then it's access rights, usage permissions, and HOA stickers on kayaks. It wasn't just about moving a vessel, it was about surrendering autonomy. They didn't see that. They didn't know who I was, what I had done, or what I was capable of. And why would they? I'd been quiet. Invisible. Just another old guy with a boat and a tan. They had no idea they were about to awaken a man who knew every legal thread they were about to tangle themselves in. They thought they were dealing with a retiree. But they were about to learn the hard way. You don't poke the man who owns the lake. It all officially began on a Thursday afternoon just after lunch. I remember that clearly because I had just come in from the dock, where I'd spent an hour polishing the trim on the boat. I was sweaty, content, and about to pour myself a glass of cold lemonade when I saw the envelope tucked into the side of my mailbox. Unlike the standard bills and flyers, this one was hand-delivered, without postage. That alone was enough to raise an eyebrow. White envelope. Glossy paper. HOA letterhead. I opened it without ceremony, expecting maybe a notice about a community garage sale or a scheduled lawn spraying. Instead, I was greeted with the same aggressive line I would come to know well. Notice of non-compliance. The letter informed me that my watercraft was in violation of HOA Rule 4.7b, which stated that no boats were to be moored on community property without prior authorization. I was told I had 7 days to remove the vessel or face escalating penalties. The kicker? A fine of $50 per day, plus potential legal action for continued trespassing. At first I was stunned. Not angry, just baffled. It was like being accused of stealing your own shoes. I reread the letter twice, then a third time, slowly, letting the ridiculousness of it sink in. Trespassing? On my own lake? I actually chuckled out loud. Not because it was funny, but because it was so wildly, hilariously uninformed. I imagined Denise sitting at her kitchen table, highlighter in one hand, bylaws in the other, dreaming up her next compliance sweep. But the laughter didn't last. The more I thought about it, the more that irritation began to simmer under my skin. The letter hadn't come with a request for clarification or a question about the boat. No one had knocked on my door. No one had asked me if I had the right to dock there. They just assumed they owned the lake, and assumed I didn't. The worst part? They addressed it to resident at my address, not even using my name. Cold. Detached. as if I were just some faceless obstacle in the way of their perfectly aligned plans. I paced around my kitchen for a few minutes, holding the letter like it might suddenly offer a better explanation. I considered ignoring it. I considered calling the HOA office and explaining the situation calmly. But something told me this wasn't going to be a one-call fix. This wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a power move. A shot across the bow. Later that evening I took a walk around the lake, hoping some fresh air would clear my head. That's when I noticed a new sign posted near the main trail entrance. Private lake access for HOA members only. Trespassers will be prosecuted. That was new. I looked around. No one else was nearby. The lake was quiet, the air heavy with summer heat and unspoken tension. They were drawing lines now, staking claims. And they thought I was the one on the wrong side. By the time I got back home, that simmer had turned into something deeper. Not rage, no, that would come later, but a firm resolve. I was being challenged. Not just by a board of petty suburban dictators, but by a system that thrived on assumption and intimidation. This was about more than a boat. This was about who got to make the rules. And who was brave enough to push back. I sat down at my desk, opened my file cabinet, and pulled out the folder marked Lake. Inside was everything: purchase documents, the deed, survey maps, tax assessments. I had made sure everything was clear and legal when I bought it. No easements. No shared access. No HOA claim. Just me, the county, and a body of water that belonged to one person. Me. I drafted a short response to the HOA, attaching a copy of the deed and highlighting the section where the lake was legally transferred into my name. I kept it professional, cordial even. I stated that the boat was docked on my property, that the HOA had no jurisdiction over the lake, and that any further fines or threats would be considered harassment. I slid the letter into an envelope, addressed it to the board, and hand-delivered it the next morning. Denise was outside when I arrived. She was watering her flower beds in that methodical, militaristic way she did everything. She looked up as I walked past and offered a tight smile that barely touched her lips. "Morning," I said, placing the envelope in the HOA drop box bolted to the community hall. She watched me with that calculating gaze I'd come to know well. Measuring, judging, assuming. She had no idea what that envelope contained. No idea what was coming. I nodded politely and walked away, knowing this was only the beginning. It was laughable. They weren't even pretending to read the documents I'd sent. I sat at my kitchen table and reread their message, shaking my head. Deed not recognized? What does that even mean? It's not a library card. It's a legally binding instrument filed with the county. This wasn't ignorance, it was stubbornness masquerading as authority. And it didn't stop there. 2 days later, I came home from a grocery run and found 2 HOA board members, strangers I recognized from the last community meeting agenda, standing near my dock, arms crossed, talking in low voices. One of them held a clipboard. The other held a camera. I watched from inside my house as they circled the boat, pointed at the waterline, took pictures of the mooring. When I stepped outside, they didn't even flinch. "Can I help you?" I asked, keeping my voice even. "We're conducting a compliance inspection," the clipboard man said without looking up. "Of my dock. Of the lake," he clarified. "And anything on or around it. That lake's private property." "No, sir," he said, flipping a page on his clipboard. "As per Section 12 of the HOA Charter, all common elements, including waterfront and associated structures, fall under board oversight." I pulled my phone out of my pocket and took a picture of them. Their expressions tightened. "You're trespassing," I said. "I've already sent you the deed. I suggest you read it this time." They left soon after, but the message was clear. They weren't backing down. That evening, I received an email from Denise herself. Long, overly formal, riddled with passive-aggressive phrasing. She accused me of creating confusion among residents, deliberately misinterpreting community agreements, and obstructing HOA operations. She said failure to comply would result in the matter being escalated to legal counsel. That one made me laugh out loud. Escalated to legal counsel? Did she think I was bluffing about owning the lake? Did she think I didn't have legal counsel? I decided to call her bluff, not with threats but with patience. I responded to her email with a scanned copy of the property map showing the lake boundary lines, the parcel ID, and the official deed once again. I included contact information for the county land office and suggested she reach out directly if she had doubts. I ended the email with, "I would appreciate your confirmation that this matter is resolved. If not, I'll consider further interference a violation of my property rights." I sent it with a satisfied click and poured myself a drink. But instead of cooling things down, that email seemed to pour gasoline on the fire. The next weekend, new signs appeared, 5 of them, planted along the main trail that bordered the lake. Large, laminated, and obnoxiously bold. Lake access restricted to HOA-approved use only. No private mooring. Violators subject to fines. The audacity made my jaw drop. They were now doubling down in full view of the community. No attempt at compromise, no acknowledgement of the documents I'd sent. It was no longer just about me. It was about power. Control. Appearances. Some neighbors started whispering. A few folks I'd seen smiling before now offered tight-lipped nods. I even overheard 2 joggers talking near the trail. One said, "I heard he's refusing to follow the rules. He thinks he owns the lake or something." The other laughed like it was the most ridiculous thing she'd ever heard. That was the moment the frustration turned personal. They weren't just ignoring facts, they were smearing me. Quietly, subtly. Turning neighbors against me with the careful precision of rumor. HOA 101. I went back through the HOA charter line by line, trying to find the source of their fantasy jurisdiction. I found vague wording about community lakes and shared amenities, but none of it applied. What? Because this lake had never been part of the HOA's land grant. The developer had separated it before finalizing the community map. That's how I was able to buy it in the first place. But these people were so used to winning, so used to residents caving under the pressure of fines and letters, that they hadn't even considered they might be wrong. Well, they were about to find out. Because I wasn't going to back down. I knew something had to change when I received the next letter, not a fine this time, but a formal cease and desist. The HOA had officially hired a lawyer. Or at least someone who could draft a letter that looked like it came from a lawyer. The language was pompous, overly legalistic, and embarrassingly vague. It accused me of violating easement expectations, impeding community enjoyment of shared resources, and, my personal favorite, fostering a disruptive environment contrary to the spirit of the HOA charter. It was written like a high school student trying to sound like a Supreme Court judge. I read it twice, then laughed so hard I had to sit down. That was the moment something in me shifted. Until then I'd been reacting, defending, correcting their nonsense with facts and hoping logic would prevail. But logic had no place in this HOA's playbook. They weren't interested in truth, they were interested in control. So I stopped defending. I started planning. And I planned like the man I used to be, the one who negotiated billion-dollar construction deals, the one who spotted loopholes like most people spot red lights. I wasn't just going to win. I was going to make sure they never tried this with anyone again. The first step? I went back to the beginning. The original sale documents, the lake survey, the developer plans, every legal scrap of paper attached to that body of water. I compiled it all into one comprehensive folder, labeled and indexed. Then I went a step further. I contacted the county assessor's office to get the most recent zoning and property line records. I also got statements confirming that the lake was never at any point part of the HOA-managed parcels. Not by easement, not by implied access, not by community charter. They had zero standing. Then I reached out to a colleague, an old friend from my legal days, now a specialist in real estate disputes. He reviewed everything and said, "You're not just right. You're bulletproof." He even drafted a brief rebuttal letter on official firm letterhead, clarifying the HOA's lack of jurisdiction and warning them that continued interference would be grounds for a harassment lawsuit. Then came the real genius move. You see, over the years the HOA had allowed a local fishing club, mostly retired guys and their grandkids, to use the lake every Sunday morning. They even listed it in their newsletter as an HOA community tradition. It was never officially authorized and they never asked me. I'd never objected. I liked seeing the kids fish. But that was leverage. I drafted a second letter, calm, courteous, but firm, and addressed it directly to the HOA president and their legal representative. In it I made 3 things very clear. I owned the lake. I attached irrefutable documentation. They had no jurisdiction to regulate it. Their actions constituted interference with private property. The fishing club was operating without my permission. And while I had previously allowed it out of goodwill, that goodwill had officially expired. I gave them 72 hours to issue a formal written retraction of all fines and accusations. If they failed to do so, I would be filing for an injunction and pursuing damages for harassment, trespassing, and defamation. Then, for good measure, I CC'd every board member, the county records office, and the local news tip line. And then I waited. Those 3 days were quiet. Too quiet. No more letters. No emails. No signs. But on the fourth day I walked out to my dock to find the fishing club gone. No kids. No retirees. Just an empty shoreline and a bitter silence hanging over the lake. The HOA had folded, all right, but instead of apologizing, they'd retaliated by pulling the plug on the community's beloved Sunday tradition. Not because they cared about fishing, but because they wanted the residents to blame me. I'll admit that one stung. I liked those kids. I liked watching them learn how to cast a line. But I knew what I had to do. That afternoon I drafted a third letter. This one was addressed to the community. I printed 30 copies and hand-delivered them door to door. In it, I explained plainly and without legalese what had happened. I clarified that I owned the lake, that the HOA had acted improperly, and that they had chosen to ban the fishing club out of spite, not law. I even included a copy of the original deed and invited anyone with questions to come talk to me personally. Then I ended with this. As the sole legal owner of the lake, I hereby reinstate permission for responsible community fishing every Sunday between sunrise and noon. All I ask is that people pick up their trash and treat the space with respect. Thank you. It was the start of something bigger than revenge. It was the beginning of the end, for the HOA's grip, for their unchecked authority, and for Denise's petty little empire. They thought they could push me around. They forgot who owned the water they were standing on. The following weekend, I woke up to laughter echoing across the lake. I stepped out onto my deck and smiled. There they were, families, fathers and sons, a few elderly couples with their lawn chairs propped on the banks. Tackle boxes open. Lines cast. Kids squealing as they reeled in sunfish like they'd landed whales. The fishing club was back in full force. It wasn't an accident. The night before, I had sent out a friendly neighborhood reminder via email and flyer drop. Lake open for fishing, sunrise to noon. Respect the water, respect each other. No mention of the HOA. No legal tone. Just a neighbor offering peace where the board had stirred conflict. And that's when it all began to unravel for them. The next HOA meeting was already scheduled for that Tuesday evening. I knew attendance would be higher than usual, and I had every intention of being there, front row, folder in hand. But I didn't even need to say a word. They imploded all by themselves. Apparently, word had spread fast, faster than Denise could control. Neighbors who never spoke much had started talking. Comparing letters. Comparing stories. Many had their own grievances, fines for invisible weeds, rules about mailbox paint colors, passive-aggressive notices about garbage cans left out too long. I'd simply provided the spark. Denise opened the meeting with her usual forced smile, reading the agenda in her clipped voice. But it was obvious she was rattled. Her fingers trembled slightly as she flipped her papers. She didn't look up much. And then, a man in the back raised his hand and asked, "Can we talk about the lake?" A hush fell over the room. Denise cleared her throat. "That's not currently on the agenda." "It is now," someone else said. I just sat there letting it happen. No need to stand or shout. This wasn't about theatrics. It was about exposure. One by one they spoke. A retired vet named Carl, who'd lived in the neighborhood longer than the HOA had existed, spoke first. "That man," he pointed to me, "owns the lake. Always has. You lied. You bullied. You tried to make him out like a criminal." A woman I'd never even met stood next. "My son cried when the fishing group was canceled. We thought he had done it. Now we know the truth." Denise's composure cracked just a hair. A flush crept up her neck. She tried to regain control, referencing community concerns and misunderstandings, but it was too late. I finally spoke up, calm and measured. I recited no laws, no threats. I simply told the truth. I've never wanted conflict. I just wanted to enjoy my property in peace. I never stopped the fishing club. They did, because they couldn't admit they were wrong. I placed the deed on the table. Silence. Then someone clapped. Just one person at first, Carl in the back. But then others joined in, hesitant at first, then stronger. It wasn't thunderous. But it was enough. Enough to show the board they'd lost the room. And Denise? She sat stiffly, lips pressed into a line, nodding like she still had control. But her eyes? Her eyes darted like cornered prey. By the end of the meeting, 3 board members had resigned, including the treasurer and vice president. Denise didn't. Not yet. But she left early, claiming a family emergency. She didn't make eye contact with anyone as she walked out. Over the next 2 weeks, things got even better. First, I received a formal letter from the HOA's attorney, this one far more carefully worded. It acknowledged the confusion, and stated they would cease further action regarding the lake and any property therein. No apology, but I didn't need one. The retreat was loud enough. Then the fines were reversed. The notice of non-compliance was formally voided. The signs? Quietly taken down one by one in the middle of the night, like some ashamed child erasing graffiti. I didn't have to lift a finger. But the best part? A petition began circulating among residents to remove Denise from the board permanently. I didn't start it. I didn't need to. The community had seen enough. And one sunny Sunday I got a knock at the door. It was the fishing club, 3 of the regulars, hats in hand. They thanked me for standing up. One of them, an older gentleman with a cane, smiled and said, "We knew something was wrong when they tried to shut you down. No one stands up to them like that. You gave us all a little courage." That stuck with me more than any fine or letter. Later that evening I walked down to the dock. My boat rocked gently on the calm surface, golden light glinting off its trim. I looked out across the water, my water, and listened to the quiet hum of summer evening life. Lawn mowers. Kids laughing. A distant splash. I'd done it. Not just one, I'd exposed them. Showed the neighborhood that the HOA wasn't some untouchable force. That they had limits. And those limits stopped at the edge of my lake. In the weeks that followed, the lake settled into a kind of peace it hadn't known in months. No more HOA spies with clipboards, no more passive-aggressive notices folded under my doormat. The signs were gone, the threats silenced, and Denise? She disappeared from view like a stone sinking to the bottom of a still pond. Word was she'd stepped down quietly after the petition reached over 50 signatures. More than enough to remove her. But the story didn't end with her. What surprised me most wasn't the victory. It was the change I saw ripple through the neighborhood afterward. People started waving again. I got invited to a barbecue by a couple who had never spoken more than a polite hello. One neighbor brought me a pie with a note that said, "Thanks for standing your ground." And every Sunday, like clockwork, the fishing club returned, sometimes bringing friends, grandkids, or just folding chairs and quiet conversation. The lake became more than a property line. It became a gathering place again. One that belonged to me legally, sure, but now it belonged to the community in spirit. On my terms. I even installed a new wooden sign at the trailhead, hand-painted and simple. Lake open to neighbors. Fish. Respect the space. It was a quiet gesture. One that didn't require approval, forms, or permission. And no one dared take it down. Looking back, I realized this was never just about a boat or a rule or some misguided HOA letter. It was about ownership, not just of property but of truth, of boundaries, of dignity. It was about the line between authority and audacity. Between policy and people. The HOA assumed I'd fold. That I'd do what most people do, pay the fine, move the boat, keep my head down. That's how they kept control. Not with power but with fear of confrontation. They underestimated what happens when someone confronts them, armed not with aggression but with facts, patience, and a rock-solid deed. They didn't just lose a battle. They lost the illusion of invincibility. And I gained something unexpected, not just peace and pride but connection. The lake wasn't a fortress anymore. It was a bridge. One I owned. One I could open wide when I chose, and close if ever needed. So here's what I learned. Sometimes doing the right thing doesn't mean staying quiet. Sometimes it means showing people where the real lines are drawn, and holding them there firmly even if your hands shake. And that's how a fishing boat, a stubborn HOA, and one very poorly written fine turned a quiet lake into a statement. Some things can't be regulated. Some people won't be pushed. And some lakes already have an owner.